And away we go. All right, so this is a virtual / in-person class today. It looks like we, for those of you at home, you'll be catching up on this afterwards. So today's a bit of a different class. All right, so before we get into today's lecture, we're going to start with a thought experiment. And I want you to examine, or I want you to imagine it's the year 2050, and you are a kid who simply has a day off school. So you do what you love to do on your days off, and you put on your extended reality headset, and before long you are shooting bad guys, and you're finding them in your viewfinder, and you are zapping them into oblivion, except what you've done in this day and age, it being 2050, is you, as a kid on your day off from school, have been zapping tumors in the brain of a live patient. And this game is appropriately called the Tumornator. So today is a class about innovation, engineering the future, and imagination. So today's lecture is called Engineering Tomorrow, Fostering a Culture of Disruption and Innovation, and I should probably add imagination after all these years. So what I hope you get out of today is, first of all, a sense of emerging trends and technologies that will impact the future of innovation, specifically as it pertains to medicine, this being a class on the future of medicine. I want to answer the why that innovation is important, and also talk about the how we learn to apply an innovation mindset in terms of interactions and social engineering. So by the end of this, I want to be able to answer the three questions: what is innovation? Why does it matter? And how does one innovate? Okay, so we're going to take a second here, and I want you to tell me not just what this is, because it's obviously a bottle, but I want you to pause on your own time and take 10 seconds to scribble down, maybe 30 seconds to scribble down 10 additional uses for this object. So you can pause the lecture here, you can quickly scribble it down. And here are some of my answers. So you can use a bottle as a planter, you can use it as a chandelier, you can use it as a bird feeder, you can use it as a jewelry holder, a makeshift jewelry holder, a pencil case, an art installation, or even a piggy bank. So a bottle can do more than just hold liquid. It can be repurposed for other options, for other purposes. And you can also re-engineer the very design of a bottle itself, because one of my gripes for a long time, since I've been teaching this course in fact, is that the bottle is inefficient, that it doesn't wholly let you access the entirety of the product that you are trying to access. And I call this a Heinz 57 tomato ketchup problem, because Heinz very famously takes pride in the fact that its bottle is inefficient. And in fact, there are folks who've innovated a solution to this over at one MIT Media Labs. And so here is a typical bottle that you can see. And you can see that, yeah, the product's coming, it's taking some doing. But you're still, leaving about 10-15% of product in there, which over billions of bottles adds up to tons and tons of wastage. Whereas if you re-engineer the bottle to have greater or decreased adhesive properties, suddenly you can access 100% of the product. So innovation is not just about thinking, repurposing things.
United Healthcare, what did we do this time?
What happened there? I'm going to go back to the lecture now. Would it be this one? Do you know how I get back there? Maybe it's this one. Getting closer. Probably, yeah, we're just going to try going back.
Oh, if you go.
Here we go, found it. Okay, perfect. All right, so innovation is about thinking about repurposing, using old ideas for new purposes, or even re-engineering the way that we've done things in the past. So we're going to skip over introductions because we did that last class. As a reminder, here is my background, a lot of stuff in extreme environments in the medical world and in the innovative sphere as well. We did introductions last time, and this is virtual, so maybe you can reintroduce yourselves asynchronously. We're going to go on and forge on ahead. So let's start with that first question. What is innovation? So innovation can be, as we said, building on new ideas. So some of you may be too young to remember when folks lined up around the block at midnight to access Microsoft Windows 95, which at that time was a hot ticket item. And then more recently was Windows 10 and now Windows 11. And then there was a time when the iPod and then the iPhone was a brand new innovation, and then building on that, the iPad. And some of you might be asking, well, it's 2023, where's my flying car? And in fact, there are companies such as TerraFugia who are actually working on concepts for flying cars. And in fact, it's not just TerraFugia. There are multiple companies out there, some of whom have even been granted FAA licenses. So here is a snapshot of one such company. You have access to the links, so I won't necessarily play all of it, but here's a snapshot.
The future has arrived. Or at least its prototype has. The air car took its first intercity journey in Slovakia, from the city of Nitra to the capital Bratislava. A 35-minute flight in a car that, at the click of a button, can transform into an aircraft in just 2 minutes and 15 seconds. In the air, it can reach 190 kilometers an hour and carry 2 people with a combined weight of 200 kilos.
It's great that the legislation allowed something like this to go from a virtual location to the real one. This is our...
So I don't know about you, but I would certainly welcome a flying car for a commute to Calgary. Innovation can also be different technologies. So it could be drones, drone technologies for food delivery, for fun, for photography, even for delivery. And when I first started teaching this course, this slide was very futuristic looking, and now it's part of our status quo. It can be integrating technologies with existing concepts. So for example, smart furniture. Maybe your ottoman senses that your feet need a rest, and this is a concept built out of Stanford. 3D printing, additive manufacturing, so print on demand. So the concept of inputting our computer files to generate a real world model of anything, so we can 3D print for art. This is actually gross and cool at the same time. Someone computer modeled the particulate matter from their sneeze and then input that into a 3D printer and then printed out their particulate matter from their sneeze, their boogers if you will, and called it art. We can have 3D printing for food, so you can have your face and eat it too. 3D printing for medicine, so here's an example of the BioBots printer used for tissue printing. For space, and in fact those two concepts are being combined now, and NASA is starting to print 3D print meniscal components for knee cartilage, for knee injuries in space, so print on demand. And you'll remember last time, that's very relevant because we talked about the packing challenges for space: low mass, low volume, low cost, with emphasis on low mass, low volume, as well as low power. And then of course using it for practical application, so medical application in the animal world. Here's a 3D printed shell for a turtle with pyramidalism. So a turtle has a prosthesis. Innovation is also the rethinking materials engineering. So here is a snapshot of a novel material used to mop up oil spills many, many times its weight. So here's what that looks like. So a novel, lightweight material that can mop up oil spills up to 90 times its weight and be reusable. And this innovation is also building on new concepts and pushing the boundaries on what's been done previously. So the next set of slides might be a little bit graphic, but this is a technology in the future medicine course, so if you're squeamish, maybe look away. So here's advanced concepts in surgery. So here is a story of a factory worker in China who lost his hand during a factory accident. The stump of his amputated arm was deemed viable. So while his stump healed, they grafted the hand onto blood supply, a viable blood supply in the leg to keep the hand alive while they waited for the stump to be healthy enough to regraft back onto. We're also in the age of xenotransplants, not just for grafts, not just for tissues, but for entire organs. So last year, we saw the first pig to human heart transplant, and lately, if you've been following headlines, we're now seeing the first genetically engineered pig to human heart transplants. So innovation can also occur incrementally, because if you took a time machine from the year 1923 to 2023, this would seem like magic or witchcraft. But this has also been in the works as incremental advances on previous innovations in transplant medicine. We also have to mention space in the Technology and the Future of Medicine lecture. So we didn't get to this part last time, but it's also thinking about different ways to give people platforms, and so that's true in human space flight. So typically, access to space has been the domain of NASA and space agency astronauts. And now with the rise of commercial space, first with suborbital space flights such as Virgin Galactic and Blue Origin, we're seeing all manner of humans have access to space through suborbital flight, and even orbital flight with the Inspiration 4 crew with SpaceX in 2021. And what this means now is, instead of being a rigorously screened, medically healthy astronaut, we're permitting all comers to access space. So that means the medicine associated with space needs to adapt as well. All right, so other examples of emerging trends and technologies, and I promise I'll tie this back to medicine as the lecture goes on, is the metaverse. So it is the next big thing. Mark Zuckerberg of Facebook, now Meta, came out and said, this is where we are putting all our money and all our future investments, creating a new virtual world, and we're going to tie that back to how that can impact medicine by the end of this lecture. We haven't yet talked about blockchain, so extremely unique, secure, complex technology, not just for finance, but also potentially for keeping patient records safe, secure, and inaccessible from people that we don't want to access it. So these are all multiple trends. We've hopefully defined what is innovation through concepts as well as concrete examples of emerging technologies. So before we move on to why it's important and how we innovate, let's also talk about other existing operating frameworks within medicine. Medicine's heavily regulated, and it's because at the core of it, we're dealing with patients, people, and principles, and we'll talk about that in the coming slides. All right, so first of all, let's talk about what it means to be healthy. So for those who are medical students in second year, this is definitely when I learned the WHO, World Health Organization, concept of health. And it's not simply the absence of disease. And I remember when I learned that, it was paradigm shifting for me. So it's the presence of complete physical, mental, and social, and some might also say sexual well-being, and not just the absence of disease or infirmity. And thinking of health in this context allows us to view health as a spectrum, and also bring in social determinants of health and talk about how those impact patient health overall. We can also look at the NIH model of patient care, so predictive, personalized, precise, preventative, participatory, and as we talked about last time, as a bonus, point of care. So these are frameworks of innovation that we talk about to how do we make medicine more directed towards the patient. Maybe not all patients need 81 milligrams of baby aspirin for stroke prevention. Maybe what would be a standard dose of amoxicillin for you for an ear infection might be too low a dose for me. So that's what we mean by personalized and precise medicine. And what would be great is if we could even prevent ourselves from getting infections. Participatory refers to shared decision making with the patient, not this kind of hierarchical model where the doctor knows all and the patient can't advocate for themselves. Point of care refers to the portability of medicine, and predictive, pretty self-evident, talks about looking at trends and keeping people healthy before they might even get sick. So again, medical students, you probably already know this, and this may have even come up during your interviews, but we talk about what it means to be a doctor and a medical expert in Canada. We talk about CanMed's competencies. So not only are you to be a manager or a leader, you're also supposed to advocate both for your patient and the system. You're supposed to keep up with changing guidelines as a scholar. You're supposed to act with the utmost of professionalism, be able to communicate complex medical concepts and terms, and also work with other specialties, other disciplines, to be able to guarantee the standard of care. The World Economic Forum also has its own framework for, more so for emerging healthcare technologies. So where they've staked their claim is on smart care, so that you can see how that kind of ties into predictive care, care anywhere, so we talked about that with portability and point of care, empowered care, there's the participatory, and then intelligent health enterprises. I would argue that's predictive, preventative. So it kind of straddles a few concepts, but it ties very closely to the NIH framework. Okay, and then because we're a Canadian course, of course, we're going to talk about the principles of the Canada Health Act. So public administration, accessibility, universality, comprehensiveness, portability. So what that means is, as a Canadian, if you are an Albertan traveling to Nova Scotia, you are still guaranteed free access to healthcare. Your healthcare coverage in Alberta extends to Nova Scotia, vice versa, and it doesn't exclude you from the same standard of care that you would get back home. And finally, the ethics, the ethical principles upon which we operate as physicians. This is fairly universal. So first of all, do no harm, non-maleficence, beneficence, act in the best interest of the patient, respect the patient's autonomy or personhood, and do what is right. So these are multiple frameworks, but they also do guide the way in which we think about technology and how we apply it to medicine. All right, so moving on. So we talked about what innovation is. We've talked about operating frameworks. So the next part of this lecture encompasses why it matters. So opportunities and problem spaces in medicine. Okay, so you have all lived through the pandemic, so I don't need to tell you that pandemic prevention, management are challenges and ongoing trends. Every year I do this lecture, I have to add another year for COVID, unfortunately, and now we're in the era of the triple-demic, so COVID, RSV, influenza. So, it's an ongoing issue. We've already talked about the need for preventative care, but just to explain that a little bit more. The burden of chronic disease, high blood pressure management, diabetes management, especially in the context of increasing longevity and expected life span for Canadians, means that while we have longer lifespans, we need to be able to support the comorbidities that come with aging. So that's what we mean by preventative care, and with that comes monitoring. A huge percentage of our Canadian populations live rurally and remote, not just in Alberta, but up north as well. Antibiotic resistance, we're going to talk about case studies and what that means for being able to fight infections and keep ahead of bug resistance. Drug repositioning, again, we'll go through a case study, taking patient context into consideration when making decisions. That's where the precision medicine comes into play. We've already talked about new technologies, and then we're going to talk about a few other case studies in this section. All right, so you've all lived through COVID-20 or COVID-19. So even in 2020, 2021, people were innovating all over the place. Companies that never made masks were suddenly pivoting to make masks. Innovators were looking at new forms of really high-tech masks, as you can see by this person who looks like they're in a biohazard chamber. And then also vaccine development. So we can also argue that there were some silver linings in the pandemic, because this is an example of a success story where science, academia, industry came together to quickly churn out highly effective vaccines with data behind them to go from preventative measures such as masking, social distancing, hand washing, to vaccine protection in the course of 18 months, which is actually quite impressive as you think about it. And so the other part of that is looking at, as we kind of talked about, the challenges of resistance, specifically with the COVID-19 virus. It's the emergence of new variations, and including vaccines that can keep up with the Omicron, the Delta, and whatever viruses continue to emerge. And then also making those vaccines multitask so they can potentially cover multiple viruses such as RSV, influenza, and COVID. So, like I said, we're in the era of the triple-demic. So right now it's not just COVID, but it's two of its nefarious buddies as well. So that's our current challenge in 2023. So while we're talking about bugs and infections, here's a case study on antibiotic resistance. So the World Health Organization came out with a statement a few years ago that antibiotic resistance is happening everywhere in the world and has the potential to affect anyone, anywhere, anytime, and is now a major public health threat. And to give you an idea, when I went through medical school, there are now what were considered machine gun, heavy, broad spectrum antibiotics are now not even, maybe they're considered mid-spectrum, and there's more broad spectrum, machine gun, heavy antibiotics, because those, what were previously considered very strong antibiotics, now have too much bacterial resistance. And so we can certainly keep broadening the spectrum into putting money into drug development and then paying a lot of money for a lot of these drugs. So for example, some of the newer antibiotics can cost up to $1,000 a dose because they're so restricted. So what's really interesting is in 2015, the first breakthrough in antibiotic resistance came in the form of tixobactin, and this was a fungal component cultured from soil, and why it took until 2015 to be able to extract this was simply because of the extraction methods for being able to take it out of the soil. And so there's sometimes knowing how to keep abreast of problems or overcome challenges in medicine is coming up with better technologies for known existing threats. So for example, to get more into specifics, because you are, some of you are in medical school, so Pip/Taz, for example, used to be considered a very broad spectrum, big gun antibiotic, and now it's the meropenams, the carbapenems, and now we have things like linezolid. So again, it's a bit scary knowing that we're kind of always in a treadmill race against bacterial resistance, but there's also an opportunity for better drug development methods and more specific drug development methods there. We talked a little bit about drug repositioning. So this is a really interesting database that's come out of Stanford and in conjunction with Hewlett-Packard. And what they did was they created this kind of match.com for drug molecules. And so they put in the 3D molecular configuration into a database, and then they tried to pair these up with receptors, molecular receptors. And what they found was novel uses for drugs that hadn't previously been considered. So for example, an anti-heartburn medication known as Zantac, for example, was found to fit in the receptor for certain forms of lung cancer, which is not intuitive, but through the use of 3D computer modeling, they were able to suggest that hypothesis. And similarly, a medication previously used for migraines and for seizures was thought to be able to be applied, and now is applied actually for inflammatory bowel disease. So this is what we mean by innovation and rethinking the way we've previously done things. Here's another application of 3D printing. So for anyone who's ever had to wear a cast, you know how uncomfortable, how itchy, how warm, how smelly, how dirty they can get. So what if you could customize the cast to the shape of your bone? Because if you've ever had a cast wrapped too tightly or had an indentation while it was hardening, you know how uncomfortable that is for 6 weeks. So if you could 3D print your cast and then leave air holes in it so that your limb can actually air itself out, not get too sweaty, have a replacement. And so that's one group, I think this was out of Russia, what they did is they created 3D printed casts. They're dishwasher safe, so they're customized, they're molded to your shape. They are ventilated, so you don't have to worry about smell. You can replace them for another one if yours gets dirty. They're waterproof. And then the latest innovation is what you see here at the far side of the screen, is they also trialed high-frequency ultrasound waves to accelerate bone healing, and in their studies had found that bone healing was accelerated by something like 33%. So also on the front of personalization, here's an example of genetic or genomics being applied for clinical use. So this is straight out of Harvard, and what they did was they generated a one-page summary for family physicians and primary care doctors to be able to use a patient's genomics for precision and personalization medicine. So for example, you can see here towards the bottom of the screen that this patient is more sensitive to warfarin, a blood thinner, so they actually might need a decreased dose. And so, they also have a whole list of medications. So metformin is the diabetes medication, and they might say, oh, hey, they respond as the average person would. So this can help with dosing. So warfarin is actually now largely out of favor for most people, but it typically requires lots of blood monitoring, and in some patients can be quite labile and hard to titrate to. So something like this might help doctors with a starting point in knowing how to dose medications. All right, so this would not be a technology in the future of medicine lecture without, of course, talking about artificial intelligence and machine learning. And so here's an example of where machine learning initially had lots of promise, but didn't work out as expected. So IBM invested a lot of money into Watson for diagnostics and machine learning. It didn't end up being that useful for that case. But Watson did go on in some cases to win Jeopardy against human contestants, but then also misidentify Toronto as the capital of Canada. So there are some pitfalls. I hope it's becoming apparent with technology as well. And there's a reason that robots haven't replaced doctors yet. So we talked about personalization in medicine. And so that's where patient context and lifestyle comes into importance with treatment, management, diagnosis. And so that's important for medicine without even talking about the importance of technology and helping improve healthcare outcomes. But interestingly enough, this is a study out of Duke University where they looked at divorce and how it impacted risks for heart attacks. And what they found was divorce was a significant risk factor for heart attacks, and particularly high in women as well. So this is where you may possibly use this kind of data to risk stratify your patients. So also it's kind of continue on this vein that it's not always a high-tech solution, but just thinking differently for healthcare outcomes. We talked a little bit about machine learning and how that might apply to diagnosis, but what about using a totally different type of intelligence? And so by that, of course, I mean pigeons. So in this particular study, they trained pigeons to correctly identify breast cancer positive pathology on slides, and they rewarded them with birdseed. And once they had trained up these pigeons, they found that they could perform breast cancer diagnosis with the same accuracy as a trained pathologist. And when it was flock sourced, the pigeon flock had even greater accuracy with diagnosis. And so then the interesting thing to know is also, this may seem like a low-tech solution, but maybe not. Animals have different senses compared to humans, obviously, and pigeons can see in the UV spectrum. So maybe that's an interesting basis for their ability to diagnose. Maybe it's not. That wasn't mentioned in this particular study, but it's interesting to think about. Okay, so to summarize, we've talked about some of these emerging trends in medicine. We've talked about 3D printing, additive manufacturing. We've talked about AI, machine learning. We haven't talked about big data yet. So looking at excuse me, the metadata around what we can learn from large population sets, and then using computational power to draw trends that we previously wouldn't have been able to see. And then amplifying that ability to analyze that data with machine learning. Geolocation, so there was an anecdotal example of, I think this was out of Australia, that they would find seasonally increased Google searches for something like magnesium supplements or cramps. And this prompted the research scientists to say, is there a seasonal variant, and is there a reason as to why their Google searches for this pathology increases seasonally and in this particular location? So it can also be used as a research tool. Smartphone apps, as well as wearables. So there are many of us out there with smartwatches. Oftentimes, doctors now will prescribe apps to help with health maintenance, preventative care, and monitoring. So for example, MyFitnessPal, I've definitely prescribed that for weight loss and calorie intake. Looking at trends, so we kind of touched on this last lecture with space medicine and talking about packing principles for space with low volume, low mass, low power, easy to use, long shelf life, low astronaut time. And so the trends in medicine include looking for tests that are faster, better, cheaper, smaller. I would also add more accessible, easy to use, and portable. And so we'll actually talk about an example of that in the virtual reality lecture. And one example of that is nanomedicine. So what if we could have small sensors circulating within our bloodstreams to look for anomalies before they happen, whether that's cancer, whether that's diabetes, whether that's high blood pressure. VR AR, again, I won't mention here, but we're going to go into detail in my fourth lecture towards the end of the course. And then human enhancement, which we'll talk about in a few slides. And of course, I would be remiss, I haven't included on this list, to talk about remote learning and telemedicine. So this is a concept you've all unfortunately become very familiar with over the course of the pandemic, whether you're working from home, learning from home, collaborating from home. And so that's also, remember what I said at the start of this section, that problem spaces are also opportunity spaces. So here's a bit of a teaser as to how we've employed that. Again, I know I keep promising virtual reality stuff. That will be in my fourth lecture. But what if you could use that problem space of having lost access to your traditional physical work and learning spaces to embrace virtual, mixed, augmented, and extended reality to recreate those working spaces. So that's what we do at Luxonic Technologies, which is one of the companies I work with. We've tested this in an extreme environment underwater. And I will leave you on that front because, again, I don't want to give too much away from that lecture. And so then we talked about coming back to the World Health definition of what it means to be healthy. It's not really the absence of disease. So I'm sure there are some of you who are sitting in front of your computer right now thinking, but what if I could make myself better? Med students, would you like to have a photographic memory? I know I would have loved that during my training years. So here's actually a really interesting article out of the New England Journal of Medicine. It's about 11 years old now. And what they have meant to do in this study is they were performing deep brain stimulation, and they found that they could create eidetic memory by stimulating per specific areas of the entorhinal region in the temporal lobe. So maybe we can use medicine not just to cure disease, address disease, prevent disease, but also make ourselves better. And so then my question to you is, if you could do that, what would you enhance? Would you give yourself a photographic memory? Would you make yourself stronger, faster? Would you never choose to sleep? Would you make yourself super efficient so that you could sleep 23 hours a day and then work 1 hour a day and get everything done that you needed to? Would you make yourself be able to eat anything you wanted without consequence, or would you make yourself only need one pill, like in the Jetsons, dating myself here, but a future looking concept where you can just have all of your nutrition in one pill. So just throwing out the concept of enhancement there as we look towards the future of medicine. But that's not without pitfalls, because I'm sure some of you might be saying, but Shawna, isn't that already happening with Neuralink? Well, yes, it is. And so for those of you who don't know, Neuralink is a company backed by Elon Musk looking at neural implants to allow participants to remotely control their prostheses through thought. And there are pitfalls, because now in the past week or so, stories have been coming out about actually there was a lot of complications, side effects, and deaths with the animal studies on primates who underwent Neuralink implantation. So those, I've included the link, it's open access. These monkeys had infections, pain, brain bleeds, and loss of hardware. So there are downsides to think about. So coming back to the section before this, whatever we do in medicine, do no harm, do it with the patient's autonomy in mind, and do it with the benefit of the patient in mind as well. Okay, with that dire warning, how do we get to innovation? This is less technical and speaks more about the social aspect of engineering, innovation. And so you will hopefully, fingers crossed, all be in class on Thursday, and we will put you to work. So keep this in mind for that. All right, so how do we get from here to there? The principles we're going to talk about in this section. People, mindset, environment, and experience. Okay, so, what is going on with this slide? It's not showing up. Okay, that's okay. Oh, that's one of my, I believe that's one of my TED Talks on innovation. So the link is there, so feel free to peruse it on your own time. Okay, so we're going to talk about people. So the reason this class is very historically interdisciplinary, we've had folks from engineers to first year immunology students to spine fellows from Nepal, is because you typically in one human lifetime cannot be an engineer, a geologist, a pilot, a surgeon. I mean, there's the odd person who is. But you don't have the experience of 7 billion people. That's why there's 7 and now 8 billion people on this planet. And so the idea is we can foster collaboration through the exchange of respective experiences and build on each other's ideas. So what I'm trying to say is you don't need to be a brain surgeon and a rocket scientist. And when we talk about principles of how we work in groups, seek to build bridges between each other. View not just leadership, but teamwork as a mortar between the bricks model. So it's easy to think of your team as a brick wall, but remember, there's no strength to that brick wall without the mortar. Without the mortar, your team, your brick wall would fall down. It's that mortar that binds everything together that creates those bridges and those relationships. So by creating that communication, that crosstalk, and that sharing experiences and starting to build on each other's ideas, that's where you bring in expertise and excellence from the engineering perspective, from the medical perspective, from the science perspective, etc. Okay, so then mindset. What kind of mindset breeds innovation? Okay, so the first of them is questioning. So hopefully it's become apparent that some of these innovations came from people saying, okay, well, what if I did this? Or how can I make this better? And so my thesis here is to question everything, and then to build on that is ask specific questions, as in, how can this be better? And I have a list of optional homework assignments for you. And it's nothing formal, it's nothing you need to turn in, but as you go about your week and through your semester in this class, as you walk through the hallways of the university, as you sit in class, as you go through traffic, as you go through the horrible traffic congestion in front of the university, ask yourself, how can this be better? And then build on that by saying, how can I make this better? And so here's a case study. Here's 18-year-old Anna Polgarian. She was a volunteer in a hospital looking at the dialysis patients and said, well, you know, these things are the size of a refrigerator and they're super expensive. What if there was, what if they need to evacuate the hospital? Or what if they were in a low resource setting where they couldn't access the dialysis machine? Or what if, you know, how can we make that more accessible? So she recreated a dialysis machine the size of a suitcase, order of magnitude cheaper, so patients could access dialysis in their homes. So, you know, she managed to do that at 18. So maybe the rest of us don't have any excuse. And then the other question is not just saying how can this be better and what is my role within that, but saying what if, you know, what is the extreme case of the scenario? What is the best case scenario? Or without intervention, what is the worst case scenario? So here to explore that question, here's another TED Talk I did on discovering exploration. So again, the link is there for your own perusal. And then just to go through a case study, med students, you're probably familiar with this if you went through your triple I block. Oh, we're going to pause this. So this is Ignaz Semmelweis. He was a physician in the 1800s. And he had this idea, which was considered too out of the box, too forward-thinking, you know, made him a pariah, actually, very sadly. And he said, well, I noticed that moms on the obstetrical unit are dying of puerperal fever after they give birth. And what if, just call me crazy, but what if we just washed our hands once we came out of the morgue and came to the delivery bedside for delivery, instead of just going straight from the morgue to the patient's bedside without washing our hands. And this simple intervention, which isn't high tech, but super novel for the time, was considered so forward-looking as to, you know, be heresy. And it actually made him a pariah, and he spent the last of his days in an asylum, which is quite sad, because right now, and especially at the beginning of the pandemic, we knew that washing hands was the standard of care. It's a criteria for audit in hospitals, and in fact, as a happy byproduct of more diligent hand washing at the beginning of the pandemic, we noticed that C. difficile infections in hospitals went down as well. So here's his one of his end-of-life quotes. Basically, when I look back upon the past, I can only dispel the sadness which falls upon me by gazing into that happy future when the infection will be banished. The conviction that such a time must inevitably, sooner or later arrive, will cheer my dying hour. So, you know, he did not have the luxury of foresight. He did not see what positive impact his concept had. And was in fact ostracized because of what he had suggested. So moving past the case study and thinking again about mindsets is learning how to project, and this may come up in our workshop, which is coming up next class, so I would love to see more the merrier here in person. On Thursday, bring friends, because the more people involved, the better the outcomes. And this also may come up on the midterm, strongly hinting and suggesting. And that is the concept of learning to project and think exponentially. Okay? So learn to anticipate what disruptive force will disrupt today's technologies. So for those of you who grew up in the 90s, you grew up in the era of dial-up internet, landlines. Maybe someone had a phone, a flip phone, maybe they didn't. There were definitely no smartphones. And 2008 was the introduction of the smartphone, and now they're pretty much ubiquitous. And so that's over the course of 3 decades that we've seen exponential introduction and then permeation of a novel technology. So how do we learn to think exponentially? So here's an example. Imagine you're on a treadmill, and imagine that you are increasing at an arithmetic rate. So that means you're starting at 1 kilometer per hour, then you're increasing at 2 kilometers per hour, then 3, then 4, then 5. So it's a very, very, very slow upward trend, and it's very easy to keep pace with. Now, if we're increasing our rate at an exponential or geometric rate, then we're suddenly going from 1 kilometer per hour to 2 to 4, and by the time you reach the next step, it's 8 kilometers per hour. That's getting a little bit fast. Then 16, now you're sprinting, 32, 64, and then splat, you hit the back wall. And so it's the same number of steps, but a much, much faster rate of advancement. And so how do we translate that into technological change? So let's look at communication and media. So So how long did it take to reach 50 million people? So for the radio, it took the radio 38 years to reach 50 million people, okay? For Facebook, social media, it took 2 years. For the last, maybe there's been some a single since then, but for one of the most recent Adele singles, it was 2 days. So that's what we mean by the exponential rate of change of the world we're living in. So again, translating that into disruption, what does that mean for how we live, how we access, how we buy, how we make transactions? So again, here's a case study. Once upon a time, the only way to buy a book was going to a bookstore. And then before long, there were chains. Some of you might remember Kohl's bookstore back in the day. And then before long, there were big box bookstores, Barnes & Noble, Indigo, Chapters, and they still exist. But then Amazon said, aha, what if we could just store books in one big repository and disrupt all of these bricks and mortar bookstores and be able to deliver books on demand? And in fact, that's what they did. But Amazon kept itself in the game by saying, well, what is the thing that could disrupt the physical warehouse where all the books are kept? And that, of course, is the Kindle. Nearly unlimited digital storage space for all the world's books. That's a bit of a hyperbole. But this is what I mean when I talk about thinking disruptively. What is the current state of technology? How has it been disrupted in the past? And what might disrupt it next? So again, here's a very familiar slide. Those of you who grew up, again, in the 90s, dating myself a bit here, will remember what we did on Friday nights. We went to Rogers Video, we went to Blockbuster Video, we went to rent videos, and then those were supplanted by DVDs. So then Netflix came along and said, well, what if we could get a DVD on demand and through the mail? And then Netflix was its own disruptive force. It became the first streaming service. And interestingly now, Netflix, they kind of stayed ahead of the trend for a little bit by also becoming its own production house, studio, and creating new shows specifically for its service. But now it's not necessarily keeping abreast of entertainment and media technologies. So now in the era of streaming, there's Hulu, there's Crave, there's HBO. You guys probably know better than I do, in fact. Okay, so then when we're talking about mindsets, we've talked about adopting exponential thinking, we've talked about adopting extreme cases, we've talked about questioning, saying what if. So what if we unbreak the system? What if we take the other extreme of a situation and say, what would this look like without any innovation? And here's a great article from a few years ago. And basically this Guelph family decided to live like it's 1986. And what had happened was they were noticing that their 2- and 4-year-old kids were glued to their iPad. They couldn't tear them away. And they realized that that's not the type of social interaction they wanted to have. So then they insisted on living like it was the year that both mom and dad were born in. So that meant the most advanced system they had was an Atari gaming machine. They could use microwaves, they could use fax machines, but if they wanted to view pictures of their nephews, they would refuse to look at them on the phone of their relatives. They would only accept developed photos from the photo lab. If they were going on a cross-country trip, they would use GPS, they would use a simple map. So that's what it means to live without technology. So then you can ask, well, if that's the extreme case on one end, what has been added, what has been lost, and what would help this situation? Okay, so this is another one of those moments in the lecture where you pause to try to answer this question on your own. So my first question for you, while we're predicting trends, is what are 10 jobs that didn't exist 10 years ago? So you can pause this, take a second, write it down. So that's the first exercise. Okay. So jobs that didn't exist 10 years ago. Okay. App developers, because we didn't really have smartphones. Data miners, big data analysts. when I first started teaching this course, a millennial generational expert wasn't a thing, and now we have Gen Z experts. When Facebook first appeared on the scene, we wondered how long it would last, and we thought, well, are social media managers, are those legitimate jobs? And now we know that the analytics around social media are extremely critical to audience reach, to advertising, and to making money. Cloud computing service providers, those are four unlinked words that 10 years ago would not have made sense. Well, 15 years ago now, would not have made sense to anyone. But now cloud computing is pretty much how we store our data. Google Drive, iCloud, Dropbox, all of that. Digital marketing managers, so that's kind of tied with social media. Managers, search, SEO, search engine optimization specialists, user design, interface, experience experts. And this one's actually becoming more of an important topic, sustainability managers. So for institutional sustainability in the context of social corporate responsibility in terms of being green, environmentally conscientious, as well as in the context of climate change as well. Okay, so that's my first question. My next exercise for you is to give me 10 jobs that will not exist in 10 years. So we're in the era 2023. I have been teaching this course since 2011 now, which actually is a very long time now that I say it. So what exists today that is on its way out? And in fact, some of these may be obsolete now. So retail cashiers are becoming fewer and far between. We have self-checkout now. Telemarketers, we get automated robots, not that that's any better. We've talked about delivery, so paper newspapers, I don't think I've seen one for a very long time. We have online news, freight and stock, we have robots for delivery. Travel agents have been supplanted by Travelocity, Expedia, Kayak, whatever your choice, search engine of choices. We still have postal workers, but we also have drone delivery with that. Taxis are in competition with Uber, Lyft. Up until this year in the hospitals, we would dictate our admissions for patients, and we would have transcriptionists. And now we have voice recognition software, and we actually type up our notes. So that has changed very recently. Librarians are still around, but they are also complemented by online search. So what's going to happen to the social media manager? I'd be curious to hear your thoughts. Okay, so last exercise, and I think you can probably see where this is going. So get ready with that pause button and that pen and paper. So jobs that will exist in 10 years. I'd be curious to hear your thoughts. Okay, and here we go. Okay, so waste data managers. So I heard this in a lecture by one of the fathers of the internet, chief evangelist at Google, Vint Cerf, and he talked about bitch rot. So in the year 3000, when we have PowerPoint 3000, are you going to be able to access your PowerPoint from the year 1990? And how are you going to manage that waste or even access it? Healthcare navigators. So healthcare is becoming increasingly fractured and complex, and now we're in the era of subspecialists and sub-subspecialists, but we also need more robust primary care. So even the definitions, not just for navigating the healthcare system, but for providing primary care, is being shared now, not just amongst family doctors, but for example, nurse practitioners. So those definitions are going to keep changing. Virtual or augmented reality architects. So remember, we're in the era of building the metaverse. Alternative currency bankers. So that actually probably should be on its own slide. That's a job that exists today that didn't exist 10 years ago. Because when I started teaching this course, that was a future-looking job. And now there are those who deal in Bitcoin, in crypto, in Ethereum, in Dogecoin. I'm sure I could yell out any term and it would probably be associated with coin. 3D printing engineers. Again, this was a future-looking job when this course started, and that exists now. Privacy managers. nonagenarian service providers, probably centenarian service providers as life expectancy increases. We talked about human enhancement, so memory augmentation specialists, extinction revivalists, so by that I mean Jurassic Park, but in fact there is a company out there trying to bring back the woolly mammoth. So again, this is kind of giving you an idea of the rate of change that over the course of the 10 or so years this course has been in existence, some of these jobs have come into fruition. And commercial and second generation astronauts. So first generation astronauts are the Apollo era, the space agency astronauts who go there for science through a government funded agency. And we're already in this era where since 2021 we have seen multiple commercial space companies. And so now the idea of what humans do in space, it's not just for science, it's not just for exploration, it can also be for manufacturing, for discovery, for fun, for tourism, and soon I'm sure for athletics and entertainment. Okay, and yeah, here's to that point about the Extinction Revivalist. Colossal is the company that is currently working to bring back the woolly mammoth. I'm not sure that the link is here, but if you Google Colossal, I promise you that it exists. Okay, so then, what are our predictions for medicine in 10 years, in the year 2033? Will I be teaching this class as an avatar? Will we all be one hive mind and I can simply transmit the entire lecture with the push of one button? Will we be back in the Stone Age, or at least in the 80s era, using pen and paper for privacy? Will it be a fusion of these things? So here's some predictions. So medicine will certainly be more portable. We will see more integration of machine learning and mixed reality. This is more of a social prediction, but we may, given on what's happening in Canada today, we may be headed towards a two-tiered healthcare system. Medicine, we're already starting to see be more predictive. We will have to cope with the burden of chronic disease, aging population, increasing lifespans, and how we care for the elderly through facilities such as long-term care facilities, keeping them at home. There'll be new support positions and navigators. We talked about subspecialties, but I think there'll be subspecialties. It'll be more personalized. We're definitely already seeing more pseudoscience. We just had to live through the pandemic to see that. And then personal enhancement. I mean, we're already in the age of nootropics, the vitamins, of sleep aids. We're already looking at surgery for enhancement. We saw that in New England Journal article for eidetic memory. So again, looking at the past, here are issues that weren't so much a priority 13 years ago: climate, pandemic planning, social media well-being, cryptocurrency management, systemic issues like racism, LGBTQ+ rights. However, these aren't really a priority now in 2023. So that's not so much a doom and gloom statement as it is a call to action, because if you're in this class, you're clearly interested in architecting the future. And one of the theses of this lecture has been that you are here to both identify problem spaces, but opportunities for positive change in these problem spaces. So my hope is that you at least learned about some avenues for innovation and implementing change this lecture, okay? Unless you're not convinced that we have anything to worry about, here's kind of a snapshot of some of the crises we're dealing with at a bigger picture, at a human scale. So there are more people considered enslaved in the year 2023 than at any other time in human history. There are more refugees worldwide, more than 50 million for the first time since the Second World War. In terms of exploration and stagnating for innovation, we haven't been back to the moon since 1972. And we know more about the surface of our moon than our oceans. We've mapped maybe 5% of our oceans to date. I don't need to belabor the point of the rate of acceleration of global warming. And then this is kind of more for discussion, but it would be really important for us to discuss the challenges with institutionalized discrimination for women's health, for LGBTQ rights, for systemic racism, and using some of the concepts we talked about today for dissecting that and creating better equity and equality for everyone. Okay, all right, so as we're heading to the last little bit here, 10 more minutes, okay, we're going to talk about additional mindsets that can help us with innovating and predicting the future. So Peter Diamandis, he's the founder and CEO of the X Prize, which incentivizes change for moonshot ideas and projects for climate change. In fact, Virgin Galactic first came emerged as a winner of the X Prize in the early 2000s. He has an entire podcast focused on future mindsets and abundance. So abundance is looking towards a future where everything is plentiful and scarcity is not a concern. He has an entire book about that. Longevity, looking at extending the human lifespan. Thinking exponentially, which we've covered, and then moonshot, asking what if questions and asking how we go from here to there and how we bridge that gap. Okay, so 2 more concepts to think about. Environment. How do we foster an environment that fosters innovation? So how do we facilitate the process for ourselves and others? Okay, so here's some case studies. So Pixar has very deliberately engineered a workspace that is open, that fosters crosstalk between different departments. To go to the mailroom, to go to the bathroom, you have to walk through the central part of the building. So the animators are talking to the computer software specialists, and ideas are born. Google has done the same thing with the open office work plan, getting rid of the cubicle with the thesis that instead of isolating people, but fostering, by engineering the workspace to foster conversation, ideas are born. Okay, so the last thing I want to talk about in terms of environment is platforms. So this is the age of empowerment. We can empower ourselves to inflict change by funding our ideas through Kickstarter, CrowdSpring, by teaching ourselves through massive open online courses, so Coursera, Khan Academy, Udacity, by using technologies to teach ourselves, like Arduino, Raspberry Pi. And then by also teaching ourselves through digital media and also broadcasting our own selves, ideas, and experiences on YouTube and digital media. Okay, the last thing we're going to talk about is experience. Okay, so here's a study out of the Harvard Business Review, and they looked at 4 people who were considered to be innovators, leaders in their field in technology. They looked at Michael Dell of Dell Computers, Peter Omidyar of Omidyar Network, Scott Cook, and Michael Lazarian. And so they found, compared to non-innovators or the general population, they had much higher traits with associating, that is bringing bridges between non-like ideas. So that's kind of what we alluded to earlier with interdisciplinary collaboration, questioning, which we talked about, observing, so asking how can this be better, experimenting, turning their ideas into reality, and then also networking, so building bridges. So despite all of this technological innovation, it comes down to the people, okay? And so there is a place for everyone and everything. We talked about 18-year-old Anna Pogarian earlier. Here is, it's the other end of the spectrum, a 91-year-old who lived in a nursing home, Barbara Knickerbocker-Veskind, was employed by IDEO, one of Silicon Valley's foremost design firms, to bring her experience for design. So she was able to work with IDEO to say, pill bottles are too hard to open with old arthritic fingers. They need to be made to be not so small, require not so many fine movements. And then she worked with them to prototype, validate, test, and iterate. Okay? So the takeaway from this is question, observe, experiment, and then there should be a 4th line, iterate. Okay? So we talked about principles of fostering innovation. We talked about people, mindset, environment, experience. Next time we're going to talk about how we turn that into reality. Next time will be a workshop type of class. So bring yourselves, bring your friends. Okay. Think about the type of future that you want to innovate. If the type of future where you or a kid on your day off of school exterminating brain tumors is horrifying to you, come up with a new concept, okay? But here are some parting thoughts. This is an amazing time to be alive. There's been never been a better time to create or innovate. There's an endless multitude of problems waiting to be solved, and there's potential in everything and everyone. And just to make sure that I was covering all the points of technology and the future of medicine before this class, I did go into ChatGPT and say, hey ChatGPT, I'm teaching a class on the technology in the future of medicine. What are 10 technologies I need to teach the class about? And it turns out we've been pretty comprehensive because we have talked about machine learning, telemedicine, remote health, personalized medicine, gene editing, nanotechnology, 3D printing, robotics, automation, AR, VR, blockchain, and wearables. So, and we've surpassed that. So it's good to know that ChatGPT approves of the contents of this lecture. So I'll just leave you with this video because come returning to the premise that there's potential in everything and everyone. Here's an example of makey and how we can leverage the potential of things that don't necessarily strike us as having potential. Let's see if it pops up for us. There you go. You can turn your pianos into a keyboard. You can turn your notebook into a video game controller. So there is potential in everything and everyone. And so coming back to one of our last premises, why do we innovate? And I think this video answers it. We innovate to make a difference.
Itong lugar namin, Sitio Maligaydos, San Vicente, San Pedro, Laguna.
Siyempre, alam mo naman, ganitong lugar, squatter area, tabing release, dikit-dikit ang bahay.
Madilim talaga rito sa lugar mo na to.
Wala kami dito sa loob, lagi kami sa labas.
Nadadapa kasi madilim, yung dadaan mo, hindi mo alam, may nakaharang.
Natutulog na lang ako, wala ilaw eh.
Ang tawag nila sa akin dito si Mang Dimi Solar. Napaliwanag ko yung mga bahay nila madilim. Bubutas ka ng yero, lalagay mo yung bote, lagyan mo siya ng sealant, bago lagyan mo siya ng tubig na mineral, lalagyan ng sundrox. Bago kapit mo sa bahay, lagyan mo sealant mo para hindi tumulo. Gaya lang kasimple yun. Dating ganito ito kadilim ng bago pagkapitan. Ngayon nung kapitan na, ito na ang liwanag niya. May naliwanag.
Pumili po ako kasi bote lang, tubig. Maliwanag na yung bahay mo.
Bumaba yung ano ko, binayaran ko ngayon. Simula ng magkapitan ako dito. At saka itong solar bottle bulb na to, hindi mainit.
Dahil sa bote na yan, sa solar na bote na yan, gumanda ang araw namin.
Ang nalagyan na namin ito ay bali 643. Gusto nga namin tuloy-tuloy para maraming matulong ng mga tao rin na yung maliwanag mga bahay nila madidilim.
Parang katulad na rin ng bumbilya. Yung dati natin ang kakalimutan, napakinabalan na ngayon.
So there you go. Technology can be simply building on new ways of using everyday objects, and bottles can be used from everything from bird feeders to sources of light in homes where electricity is not reliable or is expensive. So here are some voluntary homework options for you on the next slide here. I can get to it. Oh, there we go. Go down, okay. So this is kind of how to foster innovation. This is kind of some things that we've mentioned, okay? Some questions to get you started to kind of foster that innovation mindset, taking a notepad, wandering through your environment, saying what the inefficiencies are, what could be made better, how you can make it better, okay? And then next time we can talk about, or you can discuss amongst yourselves, what are big 3 challenges to overcome. Okay. So that is it. As always, I'm happy to take on any questions. My email address is at the very end here, or maybe not. It's kind of hidden, but you can find me first name, last name at gmail.com. Okay, and we will see you next class.